Once upon a time, in a peaceful village at the foot of a tall mountain, there lived a giant named Gorm. Gorm was the largest and strongest creature anyone had ever seen. His feet were as big as boulders and his hands were like huge shovels. Gorm could lift trees with one hand and carry heavy stones with ease. But even though he was so big and strong, Gorm wasn't very happy. You see, Gorm had a problem. He was very greedy. Gorm loved food more than anything else in the world. He loved the taste of fresh fruits, the smell of warm bread, and the sight of big, juicy vegetables. But the problem was, Gorm didn't just want some food, he wanted all the food. Every day, Gorm would come down from his mountain cave and take all the food from the village. He would grab all the apples from the trees, pull up every carrot from the ground, and take every loaf of bread from the bakery. The villagers were afraid of Gorm because he was so big, so they couldn't stop him. After collecting all the food, Gorm would take it back to his cave and pile it up. His cave was dark and cold, but it was filled with food, so much food that Gorm couldn't even eat it all. He had piles of apples, baskets of berries, stacks of berries, stacks of bread, and more vegetables than he could count. But even though Gorm had all this food, he wasn't happy. In fact, he was very lonely. The villagers, on the other hand, didn't have much to eat. Every time Gorm took their food, they were left with almost nothing. But the villagers were kind and caring people. Even though they didn't have much, they always shared what little food they had with each other. They would gather around the fire in the evening and share a simple meal, telling stories and laughing together. They were happy because they had each other, even if they didn't have a lot of food. One evening, as Gorm sat alone in his cave, he heard a sound that made him curious. It was the sound of laughter. Gorm hadn't heard laughter in a long time, so he decided to find out where it was coming from. He walked down the mountain, following the sound, until he reached the edge of the village. There, he saw something that surprised him. The villagers were sitting around a fire, sharing a small meal. They were laughing, talking, and enjoying each other's company. Gorm watched them from behind a tree, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time: loneliness. Gorm realized that even though he had all the food, he didn't have anyone to share it with. He had been so greedy that he had pushed everyone away. The food that once made him happy now seemed tasteless and boring because he had no one to enjoy it with. As Gorm watched the villagers, an old man named Harlan noticed him. Harlan was the oldest and wisest person in the village. He saw the sadness in Gorm's eyes and decided to do something that no one had ever done before. Harlan walked over to Gorm and smiled kindly. "Hello, Gorm," Harlan said. "Why don't you join us?" "We don't have much, but we'd be happy to share our meal with you." Gorm was shocked. No one had ever invited him to share a meal before. He wasn't sure what to do, but the warmth in Harlan's voice made him feel welcome, so Gorm nodded and slowly walked over to the fire. The villagers were a little scared at first, but Harlan reassured them. "Gorm is our guest tonight," he said. "Let's make him feel welcome." The villagers smiled and handed Gorm a bowl of stew. It wasn't much, just some vegetables and a little bit of meat, but it was the best tasting meal Gorm had ever had. He ate slowly, savouring every bite, but what he enjoyed even more was the company. The villagers told stories, laughed and made jokes, and for the first time in a long time, Gorm felt truly happy. After dinner, Gorm stayed with the villagers, listening to their stories and laughing along with them. He realized that he had been missing out on something much more important than food friendship. That night, as Gorm walked back to his cave, he thought about what had happened. He had always believed that having all food would make him happy, but now he knew that wasn't true. What he really needed was to share with others. The next morning, Gorm decided to do something he had never done before. He went to his cave and looked at all the food he had hoarded. There was so much food that some of it had started to rot because he couldn't eat it all by himself. Gorm realized that he had been wasting food while the villagers were going hungry. With a determined look on his face, Gorm started carrying the food down the mountain. He took all the apples, the bread, the vegetables, and the berries back to the village. The villagers were surprised to see Gorm coming down the mountain with all the food, but when they saw that he was sharing it with them, they were overjoyed. "Thank you, Gorm," the villagers exclaimed as they took the food from him. "We're so happy you've decided to share with us." Gorm smiled, feeling a warmth in his heart that he had never felt before. It was the joy of giving, of making others happy. The villagers invited Gorm to join them for another meal that evening, and this time Gorm brought even more food to share. As they sat around the fire that night, Gorm realized that he was no longer lonely. He had friends now, people who cared about him, and that made him happier than all the food in the world ever could. From that day on, Gorm was known as the generous giant, and he became an important part of the village. Gorm learned that it wasn't the food that made him happy, but the people he shared it with. He discovered that generosity brought him more joy than greed ever could, and he never went back to his old ways. The villagers and Gorm lived happily together, always sharing their food, their stories and their laughter, and Gorm's cave, once filled with hoarded food, became a place where the villagers would gather for feasts and celebrations, thanks to the giant who learned the true meaning of happiness.